Hi everyone, Christina here. Welcome to another card video at my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be using the Happy Mailbox Cubbies stamps and dies from our Impressions. This is a set that stamps a grouping of mailboxes, and then their dies cut out the outer edge of the mailbox grouping, as well as all the flaps and the different hinges to open up those mailboxes. So then you can place all of those little images inside, all the different little envelopes and hearts and things like that. So I'm going to be creating both a card and envelope using that stamp set. And I'm going to start out by creating the envelope using some watercolor paper. This is Canson foundational watercolor paper. It's 90 pounds, so it's a little bit thinner. This is the weight of watercolor paper that I like to use when I create my own envelopes. So I'm using We Are Memory Keepers 123 punch board, which I prefer over the regular envelope punch board. Maybe I'll do a video on that coming up. So I've created my envelope and I folded in 3 of the flaps so that it fits inside my MISTI stamp positioning tool. I'm going to stamp the large mailbox image a couple of times onto the watercolor paper in Versafine Onyx black ink. And I'm stamping it twice so that I get a very clean lined image and I don't have any gaps in the lines. Because it is watercolor paper and a little bit textured, sometimes you do need to stamp these images multiple times. So after I had that stamped, I opened up the envelope and I taped it to a hardboard. This is the board it's going to stay on for all of the painting. Now I want to create an area right above the mailboxes where I will have the person's address. And I wanted to make sure that I wouldn't run into the stamps in the top corner. So I picked out my postage stamp, some current forever stamps, and also vintage stamps. Just place them in the top corner temporarily and then drew a cloud shape right above those mailboxes. I'm going to have the address inside the cloud, and I'm going to paint a nice blue sky color around the cloud. And to make it just a little bit easier, I thought I would use some liquid masking fluid to protect the edges of the cloud. I also painted on that masking fluid over the mailbox image so that I could paint around that without having to worry about keeping the interior areas of the mailboxes clean of any color. So that drawing gum does have to dry completely before I can start painting, so I set that aside and started to work on the card. I'm using some Fabriano Artistico extra white hot press watercolor paper. Hot press paper is more smooth than cold press, and I thought it would just be fun to try it out for this particular card. I then stamped the large mailbox image and all of the other images in the stamp set. This includes a bird, a few different envelopes, a scroll, a paper that's kind of like it's kind of rolled out, I guess you would say, and there's also a gift package and maybe like a heart box filled with chocolates or something like that. So I stamped these a couple times to get a really nice clean image. And then as far as watercoloring goes, I'm going to use my Peerless watercolor palette. I haven't broken this out in a very, very long time. So maybe some of you who are new to my channel have never even seen it. But basically, Peerless watercolors are flat sheets of watercolor that you can then pick up the pigment with a wet brush. So it's very, very flat, and you just pick up the color. Now, I created a palette based on one by Julie Ebersol. I'll link to her video up in the top corner. And basically, I have 1-inch squares of each of these colors. They're adhered down to a palette. And then I have the 2 sides of the book separated by a piece of plastic or acetate, and that protects the different little paint swatches or paint chips, but also gives me somewhere slick to kind of put that paint onto and pick up more paint from the palette. So I used the Peerless watercolors for all of my painting. I mostly did shades of blue and red, maybe a little bit of cream, and lots of gray. I wanted to keep this very monochromatic, not have too much color, and I wanted the colors to match the postage stamps that I picked out for my envelope as well. So after I painted all of that on the hot press watercolor paper, I then came over to my envelope, which the drying gum had completely dried at this point, and I put down a layer of just clean water and then started dropping in color. You can see me picking up that color from my palette over on the side just with a damp brush. It picks up that color and then you can start transferring it onto your project. So I painted all of this blue area. Then I hit it with a heat tool to speed along the drying process. And once that was completely dry, I was able to rub my fingers across the surface and ball up all of that liquid masking fluid. You can see how it protected those areas and they're completely white underneath. I then used the same colors that I used with the previous painting piece and colored in all of the areas on the mailboxes. Now I did notice a couple of differences between using this watercolor paper versus the hot press watercolor paper from before. The hot press watercolor paper with the Peerless watercolors, it didn't want to spread the colors out very much. It was hard to prevent there being a really harsh line with all the colors I added, whereas using this watercolor paper, which is more cold press in characteristics, it really allowed the color to spread. It was a little bit easier to paint on this cold press watercolor paper as compared to the hot press. After that was completely painted, it was time just to address the envelope. And I did a little practice run using some markers, and I wanted to cut it out and kind of get an idea of where it would be on the envelope. I'm using two colors of Caron markers, lipstick red and red. I'm going to start out with the red color first, which is a little bit lighter, and I'm going to letter on Katie's name. Now, Katie did give me permission to use her address on mail art, so thank you so much, Katie. And if you would like to submit your address for consideration for future mail art projects, I'll have a link down below in the video description. It's for my monthly giveaways, and I just have a new form every month so that those addresses stay current. After I wrote her name in red, I then took lipstick red, a little bit of a darker shade, and added that color to the very bottom of the letters, and then used a slightly damp paintbrush to blend those two colors together. You can see even a little bit more over here on her last name, because at this point I was getting really used to how I was going to do this particular technique. So after I had painted on her entire name, I then went over and just added the please deliver to right above her name. And you don't always have to put please deliver to or kindly deliver to, but I thought it would be helpful since this envelope is a little bit of a different orientation. And I just used a Tombow mono pen for this. Then switched to a slightly thicker pen and wrote her address down below. Now you'll notice I did have a little bit of smudging off to the side from my hand. That's because the Caron markers are quite juicy and very, very wet. You do have to allow them to dry quite a bit or they can smear and smudge. And every time I use these after I haven't used them in a while, I forget about that. And so I usually remember quite quickly when I start to smear and smudge these. But as long as you're aware that that is an issue and you need to allow things to dry, it's not a problem. And I really do love these markers because they do stay wet for a long time. They work beautifully when you're watercolor painting with them as well. Added some hearts around those areas, and then I came in with a light gray Tombow marker, which I have a little more control over these and a smaller tip, and I added a shadow to the side of her name. I then adhered all of the postage stamps. For the ones that needed moisture, I just used a water brush to add moisture to the back and then adhere that directly onto the envelope. Now I'm going to hit this with my heat tool to dry it quite a lot. I want to make sure it's completely dry before I go in and seal it with some Distress micro glaze. This product is perfect for protecting any areas on projects or on envelopes that you want to prevent having any issues with moisture. So because this is watercolor and it's highly reactive with any additional moisture, I need to put down a barrier so that if this envelope comes into contact with anything wet, that nothing will move around or get ruined. So microglaze, it puts down like kind of almost like a slick barrier. And after you have this applied, you can actually sprinkle on water and you will see it bead up on top of the paper. So I applied that with a mini round blending tool, just added quite a bit. And then I used a paper towel to buff off the excess. And I did avoid the postage stamps when I was doing this because you do need to allow the postage stamps to be canceled. And the post office can't really do that. Like ink will bead up, it won't even stick to it if you have that microglaze over your postage stamps. So I sealed up the envelope using some Express-It tape, and I just put it on a couple of the flaps, making sure it didn't completely close it up. And then I turned my envelope over and I added my return address to the flap. This is a custom stamp that I created using a Silhouette mint machine. I'll have that link down below if you're interested. And I just stamped that onto the back of my envelope. And now my envelope is complete. So I'm going to go back and return to my card design and make a very, very simple card using the project set in completion with the dies and the stamps. So I taped down those dies so they wouldn't move and ran them through my die cutting machine. And then for these additional envelopes that I stamped, instead of die cutting them, I decided to just use my scissors since they were such simple shapes. My card base is made out of some Neenah Desert Storm cardstock. This is the 100-pound version, and I've scored that at 5.5 to create a side folding card. I then assembled my entire cubby area where I tucked these little images into the mailboxes, and I put a little bit of foam tape behind some of them, or other ones I just used glue. And after I had all of these little cubbies kind of filled, except for just a couple, I then put some foam tape on the back, and I set that aside for just a minute while I stamped my card base, putting this "Sending Smiles Across the Miles" sentiment on the card base. And then I removed the release paper off the foam tape on the back of my cubbies piece, and then put that directly onto the card front. Now, there was so much happening with all these mailboxes, I decided to keep that greeting very, very simple and just stamp it onto the card base. I also added that die cut bird and a couple of envelopes, and that finishes the card. So that's my set of an envelope and a card using the Art Impressions Happy Mailbox Cubbies project kit. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. This was a lot of fun. It was time consuming to do both of these projects, but completely worth it. On screen, I've got some more Art Impressions projects for you to check out. I have the Cubbies, another example of their Cubbies project sets up here, as well as 2 other things for you to check out. Thanks so much for watching today. I will be back with another card video very, very soon.